Well, what an absolute joy it is to be here with you all as we adjust the sound. Let me just say, I'll speak for myself. We're going to be talking about a very combustible subject this evening on race. And let me just tell you, some of y'all, I just sensed you came in like this, bracing yourself for a biblical beatdown. That is not how I roll. This is not, I'm not an angry black person. I live in the Bay, so love living here. So far, me and my wife are in a good season of marriage. Kids are being compliant, at least today, so I didn't come here with an attitude, none of that. I'm just grateful to just lay out some things before you that, yes, do have sociological implications, but what I want to share, at least in my part of the presentation, is going to be anchored deeply in the Word of God. So I understand some of you are here, you wouldn't call yourself Christians. I think it's important for me to just come right through the front door and not in any sense of superiority, but to tell you that what I'm going to be presenting comes from a worldview that has been formed and shaped biblically. And so that is how I'm going to approach this. But at the same time, you know, I serve on the board of trustees at Biola University. And we had Cornell West on a panel similar to this at our school. And Dr. West said, look, if you come to this institution for 4 years and you leave pretty much thinking the same way you did when you got here, then this institution has failed you. And I would say to you this evening, if at the end of my presentation you don't feel any sense of disequilibrium, then maybe I've failed you. So I want you to toe that tension with me this evening. I'm not here to be contentious, not at all. But at the same time, when you talk about race and you do it faithfully and it's tethered to the Word of God and the gospel of God, because now we're pressing against America's historic sin, this should create a little bit of angst with us. So I want you to live in that tension with me this evening. Love seeing my friend Steve, and he always beats up on me on the golf course and all that good stuff. You all know this better than me, but people first came to, they migrated to California in the 1840s primarily out of gold. I believe that in this thing called principalities and powers that the Bible talks about. There's a well-known pastor, Tim Keller. He says, whenever you walk into a city, especially as a church planter or a church leader, you should always ask the question, what are the unique idols here? And I think, going back to the 1840s, that one of the unique idols that has really tethered itself and entwined itself in the Bay Area has been this thing called gold. That's why people came here. They originally came to the eastern seaboard of America for religious reasons. They did not come to California for religious reasons. They came here for very material reasons. And I think that spirit of gold is still here, even though it looks a whole lot different. I did my first tour of duty in Southern California. I was there for 6 years. Very profitable time. Met my wife. Very profitable time. Went to grad school. Worked at a couple of churches there. This is my second tour of duty in California. And I was doing dinner with a friend not too long ago who's lived both in Southern California, Northern California, the Bay Area. And I just kind of asked him, what do you think the differences are? And I thought what he said was profound. I'm still chewing on it. He said, in Los Angeles, the preeminent value is image. In the Bay, the preeminent value, he said, is production. I'm still chewing on that, almost 3 years in, but that resonates with me. Here the idea is, what can you produce? I know there's a bit of that no matter what region you're in, but I think that's true here in all caps. What can you produce? What's the bottom line? Now, because of that, and I am inching my way into how that tethers into race, but because of that, the primary problem that we have here is, in an area that values production in all caps, that kind of reduces people and dehumanizes people into utilitarian objects. So the moment you can no longer produce for me, I no longer need you. And because we are in a high production culture, the primary color here is not black, white, yellow, brown, it's green. And as long as you can produce that green, We don't care too much about what your ethnicity may be. So here's the problem. I pastored for 12 years in Memphis, and in Memphis, the idol there is very much a racist idol, and it's kind of more of an aggressive form of racism. There's a country club there in Memphis that to this day I could not join because they don't allow black members. Now that doesn't play well here in the Bay. We don't have that here in the Bay to my knowledge, but I think the issue of race here is a lot different. What it feels like for me, again, 3 years into it, is that this is more of a colorblind place. Where, yes, to some extent, we'll talk some about different ethnicities, but what I've felt, especially among the Christian crowd, and I know I'm preaching to the crowd this evening, is, now why are we talking about race and this kind of a colorblind ethic? So in this production society that dehumanizes people and has a colorblind ethic, this is where churches like Westgate and Abundant Life and so many others stand. And I think we have a unique call in the Bay to create an environment to where people, when they walk in, we want to let them understand that we value you not for what you produce, but simply because you've been made in the image of God. You have intrinsic value. I think that's a profound message churches need to be sending here in the Bay. But I also think in the Bay that churches need to be moving from this kind of colorblind ethic to a celebration, not idolization, but a celebration ethic where we enter into one another's ethnicities, narratives, and stories. To help us with this, I want to read to you a couple verses out of 1 Corinthians chapter 9. This is written by the Apostle Paul, and he deals profoundly with such things as race, and he tethers it to the gospel. Listen to what he says in verse 19. Paul writes, "For though I am free for all, I have made myself a servant to all, that I might win more of them. To the Jews, I became a Jew in order to win Jews. To those under the law, I became as one under the law, though not myself being under the law, that I might win those under the law. To those outside the law," he's talking about ethnic Gentiles, "I became as one outside the law, not being outside the law of God, but under the law of Christ, that I might win those outside the law. To the weak, I became weak, that I might win the weak. I love this. I become all things to all people." And so you can just kind of slide in there. Paul would say, to the Indian, I became Indian. To the Japanese, I became Japanese, if that was his context. That by all means I might save some. Now, Paul, why is your community so eclectic? Verse 23, "I do it all for the sake of the gospel." See, Paul he's not, our liberal friends, our progressive friends, I don't use that term pejoratively, we would say they're into diversity. But here's what separates Christian diversity from the diversity of our liberal friends or progressive friends. Paul is saying, I don't do it just for the sake of diversity. So I don't have these eclectic relationships so that I can show you how hip or how cool I am. No, Paul says, I do it all, verse 23, for the sake of the gospel, that I may share with them in its blessings. Dr. King, he wrote the prison epistle of the civil rights movement. It's called Letter from a Birmingham Jail. Anybody here ever read that letter? I want to encourage you, read it in full. And he is responding not to some fringe terrorist group like the KKK. He's actually responding to 10 white clergy who were embarrassed that Dr. King and his lieutenants were there to stand up against segregation in Birmingham, spring of 1963. So these 10 white clergymen write this open letter kind of saying to King, we need you to wait. Just bide your time. We don't need to talk about race. We don't need to talk about issues of integration. Just chill out, and someday things will just run its natural course. So they had a very passive posture. I want you to look with me on the screen at Dr. King's response. Here he is, just kind of writing on scraps of paper, and he's pretty much saying, here's why we can't wait. Look at it with me. Dr. King writes, I've heard numerous Southern religious leaders admonish their worshipers to comply with the desegregation decision because it is the law. But I've longed to hear white ministers declare, follow this decree because integration is morally right and because the Negro is your brother. In the midst of blatant injustices inflicted upon the Negro, I have watched white churchmen stand on the sideline and mouth pious irrelevancies and sanctimonious trivialities. I've traveled the length and breadth of Alabama, Mississippi, and all the other southern states. On sweltering summer days and crisp autumn mornings, I have looked at the South's beautiful churches with their lofty spires pointing heavenward. I have beheld the impressive outlines of her massive religious education buildings. Over and over, I've found myself asking, hear it, what kind of people worship here? Who is their God? Where were their voices when the lips of Governor Barnett dripped with words of interposition and nullification? Where were they when Governor Wallace gave a clarion call for defiance and hatred? Where were their voices of support when bruised and weary Negro men and women decided to rise from the dark dungeons of complacency to the bright hills of creative protests? These questions are still in my mind. This last line gets me. In deep disappointment, I have wept over the laxity of the church. Wow. Tragically, his letter is still relevant. Because again, what he's attacking is not the Bull Connors. He's not attacking the, again, outlier terrorist groups like the KKK. He's just pushing against what kind of theology allows you to come to church, hear fine homiletical masterpieces while injustice is raging in the streets, and you do nothing. Something's off here. He says, I've wept over the laxity of the church. I still think that's happening today. It's what I'm terming evangelical passivity. And I think many of our conservative evangelical churches are still very much in a passive posture as it relates to issues of racial injustice, whether personal incidents or systemic injustice. These sorts of things continue to happen. I wish I had time to unpack this more, but I want to hurry up and make room for the panel and the rest of the evening. I do want to say a couple of things. If there's one thing 1 Corinthians 9 teaches us, and it's really the life and ministry of Paul, Paul did not model for us evangelical passivity. Paul models for us redemptive impatience. Again, if you're here tonight and you wouldn't call yourself a Christian, but you just want to kind of learn what the Bible has to say about race, I want to encourage you, read the book of Acts, and especially pay attention to whenever Paul walks into a city and he's going to plant a church, he's going to start a new one, he always asks two questions, always. And these two questions are informed by a verse that he wrote in Romans chapter 1, verse 16, when he says, I am not ashamed of the gospel, for it is the power of God unto salvation to those who believe. Listen to it, not to the Jew only, but to the Jew first, and also the Greek. So whenever Paul walks into town, he always has two questions. Number one, where's the synagogue? I want to hang out with the Jews. I want to share Christ with them. In Athens, Acts chapter 17, read it. He goes to the synagogue, shares Christ with them. Some Jews come to faith, but he's not done. At the end, he goes, now where do the Gentiles hang out? And they point to him to the top of a hill called Mars Hill. In fact, you can still see the plaque, if you've been there, where Paul actually preached. He hangs out with these Greek philosophers, shares Christ, points to an altar dedicated to an unknown God, and he shares Christ with them, and some of them come to faith in Jesus Christ. Now, Paul has an incredible problem. Why? Because in the ancient world, Jews and Gentiles didn't do life with each other. They just didn't mix. So conventional wisdom would tell Paul, here's what you do, start two churches. Start one on the north side of town for the Jews and one on the south side of town for the Gentiles. In fact, in the mid-20th century, there was a church growth technique called the homogeneous unit principle, which is a very pragmatic principle. They would say to young church planters, here's what you do. Find your demographic, your ethnic demographic, cater to your ethnic demographic, and build your church around it. In fact, Bill Hybels, I don't know if I should have quoted him, forgive me, he actually apologized because that's how he planted his church originally, around that principle. Highly pragmatic, highly unbiblical. Paul doesn't start two churches. He says, listen, now that you've been vertically reconciled to God, I need you to work out that vertical reconciliation horizontally, and I need you to do life with people who don't look like, act like, think like, or vote like you. That's right. Paul is saying, I actually need Fox News people to go to church with MSNBC people. I need you to do that. Now, Paul, why do you do that? He says, I do it all for the sake of the gospel. Now, if you're a Christian here tonight, you've heard that term gospel. And if you grew up in the church, maybe you were conditioned to hear the gospel solely in terms of your personal relationship with Jesus Christ. Now, I know that's a nice, cute phrase, but it's not a biblical one. Many of us think of the gospel as, me having a consecutive quiet time streak where I wake up every morning and pull out my Beth Moore Bible study deal with my Beth Moore bobblehead doll, and I love Beth Moore, by the way, and I'm just kind of sitting there in quiet time, quiet time, quiet time, quiet time, quiet time, but that's only half the story. See, the gospel is not just you and Jesus, but the gospel is both vertical and it's horizontal. In other words, the primary way you know you're saved is seen in how you relate to other people. So just like we would say an unforgiving Christian is an oxymoron, we would also say a racist Christian or an ethnically indifferent Christian who's really not thinking proactively and standing up for the marginalized is likewise an oxymoron. So Paul says the gospel I understand pushes me not just towards Jews who I'm comfortable with. It actually pushes me to go to the other side of the tracks and do life with people who just see it differently. Now, so if we're going to have this talk about race, we just got to go, what's your operating system? And your operating system has got to be the gospel, but also what it takes, secondly, is relational intentionality. So I just want you to think of, again, 1 Corinthians 9, Paul says, look, I want you to hang out with me. And if you hung out with me on a Monday, you might run into me at a restaurant, a kosher restaurant, enjoying a kosher meal with my Jewish buddies. But then if you ran into me on a Tuesday, I might be at a rib joint with my Gentile friends eating barbecue ribs. Why do you do that, Paul? Paul says, I do it for the sake of the gospel, but I also want you to see Paul's relational intentionality. In fact, you need to understand, the reason why Paul goes to jail for the last time is because he's falsely accused of taking his Greek friend Trophimus into the forbidden part of the temple to worship. Paul had eclectic friendships. And see, here's where it gets uncomfortable for us. I've always led multi-ethnic churches. I've always pushed churches into being more and more multi-ethnic because I just believe once the gospel gets inside of you and you understand that Jesus died for the world, then I should actually have a heart for the world. And one of the things I always tell the churches I've led as we've tried to push towards multi-ethnicity is don't look at me as to kind of be the only one responsible in this church for this. No, if people are still coming to church out of relationships, then sanctuaries reflect dinner tables. So if you want a diverse sanctuary, it starts with your dinner table. How diverse is your dinner table? But here's where it gets uncomfortable. I think the last time I was here with you, I shared. So, Dr. Corey Edwards, she's a PhD. She's a professor of sociology, loves Jesus, but she's a sociologist at The Ohio State University. She always makes me put a "the" on it. She actually says if you go to a homogenous churches actually entrench racism. Why? Because all of us have biases. Not all of you, we all have biases. And if you only do life with people who, for the most part, see it the way you do, your biases will never be challenged, only entrenched. So as a part of your own spiritual formation, you need to surround yourself with people who see it differently. I'll be honest with you, sometimes something happened, and in my flesh, I want to write off white people. Here's how the Lord deals with me on that. He'll bring up in real time deep, authentic, substantive friendships with white people. White people like Dennis Rainey. Dennis Rainey is a redneck, good old boy from the Ozark Mountains. And Dennis Rainey, he lives in Little Rock. And one day, Dennis called me up and said, "Hey man, why don't you come out to Little Rock? There's some things I want to talk to you about." And figured we can just go on a hike together and yada yada yada. And I had to stop him. When you say hike, Dennis, do you mean like walk through the woods? Because black people don't do that. It's just not how we roll. Dennis then responded by saying, "Oh, you're kind of stereotyping, yada yada yada." I said, "No, Dennis, watch the Discovery Channel for a week. And count how many Keishas or Tyrones you see on the Discovery Channel." Like some news stories, black folk ain't had nothing to do with. Man gets mauled by a bear. You've never heard of Tyrone getting mauled by a bear. It just doesn't happen. But in my 15 years hanging out with Dennis Rainey, man, he's got me duck hunting now. And I love it. Middle of January, Stuttgart, Arkansas, sitting in camo, 12-gauge shotgun. I love it. What am I saying here beyond all the humor? My life has just been enriched, profoundly enriched, because I'm doing relationships with people who look differently from me and who just see it differently. And what brings us together in the deepest, most formative, substantive ways is the gospel of Jesus Christ. I'll go home on this one. But when you start talking about this stuff, see, this kind of stuff now gets messy. It gets messy. One of the ways we know this is if you take time to read Paul's letters, because most of Paul's churches that he planted were multi-ethnic. If you read his letters, we know they're multi-ethnic and we know they're messy because of some of the stuff he's got to talk about. Like he's got to talk about food. Now, if it's an all-Jewish food, an all-Jewish church, food ain't an issue. Just eat your kosher meal, that's it. But when you got Jews and Gentiles coming together, and the Gentile family invites the Jewish family over to the house for dinner, and the Jewish family sits down and they're staring at them, is a pork chop? Houston, we've got a problem. So Paul has to wade into it, and he's got to get into the mess. I hate election seasons at multi-ethnic churches. I hate them. The head of Trump's campaign for Santa Clara County was a member of my church. She's now been given a job by him in the administration, but man, every single day, it's text messages and, Satan's coming against Donald Trump and yada, yada, yada. And I'm just like, oh my gosh, it's messy. Then on the other hand, I got pray for Hillary Clinton and this, and that, and Satan's coming against her and yada, 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 yada. And it's messy, but I love the fact that they're in church together. See, this is what Paul gets to in our text. Over and over again, he says, I have become. I have become. I have become. One commentator says, this is the idea of getting into another person's skin to feel what they feel. It's I have become. And in this is discomfort. By the way, the ultimate example of I have become is Jesus Christ. He came into literally the skin of humanity to walk with us, to die for us. This is what it means. And so I want you to just lean into the tension and into the mess. And here's what concerns me. When we have conversations like this, let me make this point and give a closing story. But here's what concerns me about these things. And what I'm going to say is I know it's not really popular among many minorities, but I get concerned in Christian circles that authentic relationships with whites and minorities is being hijacked by white guilt. So I think a sign of authentic, deep reconciliation, a sign of true koinonia, fellowship, friendship, is the ability for two different people to express variant viewpoints and opinions without leaving each other in a huff. See, if you followed my wife and I around for 6 months, and you notice I was the only one expressing myself, and my wife, she just took it. She never pushed back. She never offered a contrarian opinion. You would not go, healthy marriage. What makes our marriage healthy is both of us trust and love each other enough to go there and express variant viewpoints. See, until we can get to the point where, and I'm not saying all white people or most white people think this way, but until we can get to the point where some of my white friends can go, hey, I actually voted for Trump and my 401k thanks him, drop the mic. Until we can get to that point, I don't think reconciliation has happened. And so we throw phrases around like white privilege, which, by the way, another variant viewpoint, hope this is a safe place. I don't like that phrase, white privilege. I think I understand the root of it, but privilege is not the problem. It's the stewardship of privilege that's the problem. My parents have been married for 47 years. They're still together. They love Jesus. They love me. I got to tell you something. That's a measure of privilege. If privilege was innately sinful, then Jesus was the most sinful person to have ever lived. Because he was born profoundly privileged. God. Like, trump that one. You can't trump that one. So we got to be careful with our terminology. I know what we're implying when we talk about white privilege. We're implying the poor stewardship. But all of us, if you look hard enough at your narrative, I don't care what your ethnicity, all of us have a measure of privilege. Privilege isn't the problem. It's how we're stewarding that. Go home on this one. So there's a guy in church history, his name is Dietrich Bonhoeffer. Anybody here ever heard of Dietrich Bonhoeffer? Profound. I think you should, if you don't know of him, you should know him. Whenever I'm in London, I always like to go to Westminster Abbey, and there's a monument dedicated to his honor. Dietrich Bonhoeffer, you need to read a book if you haven't read it. It's called Bonhoeffer's Black Jesus. Reggie Williams wrote it. It's his PhD dissertation, but it's highly accessible. Dietrich Bonhoeffer was a bit of a prodigy in his early 20s. He graduated with his PhD. He decides to take a fellowship right in the heart of Harlem in the 1930s. At Union Seminary, which is part of Columbia University. He gets over there. He would say, in hindsight, I wasn't a Christian, but at the time I thought I was a Christian. So because I thought I was a Christian, I tried all these churches. Most of them were white. None of them did it for me, Bonhoeffer says. And so he decides to join the Abyssinian Baptist Church. It's a historic black church in Harlem. Forget Bonhoeffer, blonde hair, blue eyes, walks into Abyssinian Baptist Church, 1930s, height of the Harlem Renaissance. And what does Bonhoeffer say? It's the first time in my life that I ever hear the gospel and all of its robust implications. My words, vertical and horizontal. You know that phrase, cheap grace? Bonhoeffer didn't coin that. He got it from his black pastor. Bonhoeffer joins that church, which means he's following black leadership. He serves in Sunday school. He meets a guy named Albert Fisher, African-American man, who introduces Bonhoeffer to Negro spirituals, which he falls in love with. He takes him back with him to Germany, plays him at his makeshift seminary. Albert Fisher then takes him on a trip of the Jim Crow South, and what Bonhoeffer sees horrifies him. Do you know Bonhoeffer actually says, I never go back to Germany to stand up against Hitler and for the Jews unless I first go to the black church and hear the gospel for the oppressed. What is Bonhoeffer saying? I have become. That changed my life. And it's here where I believe minorities have a leg up on our white brothers and sisters because, here's the disequilibrium, because even in 2018, white people can be successful by the world's standards, highly educated, make good money, without ever having to I have become when it comes to other ethnicities. But show me a highly educated, highly successful by the world standards minority, and I will show you someone who at some point had to. I have become. I have become is part of core curriculum to the Christian life. What we're getting at here is not an elective. It's core curriculum because Paul tethers it to the gospel. Let me pray for us, and we can dive in. Father, thanks for tonight, and thanks for the ability to just express some thoughts that I hope are accurate and fair to the Scriptures. And I do pray, Lord God, for robust interaction and dialogue as we continue on. In Jesus' name.